Okay, so it's now time to look at PHP variables. So variables are pretty much everything within a language, and they basically hold all of the data and values that you're going to work with. Now think of these as just little storage areas in your code for either text, numbers, and just any other data type, which we'll be talking about in the rest of the series. Now for now, let's take a look at how we create a variable, assign a value to it, and then go ahead and output it to the page. And then we'll talk about some of the other rules and advice around variable naming and how to do some other things with them. So as always, we start with our PHP tag at the top of our page. And then down here, what we're going to do is use a $sign to start a variable name. So here, I'm going to just give this a name of name, and then I'm going to assign my name to it. So with this, we use an equals symbol and then just the value. Now we've already seen what a string looks like when we created our first PHP file, but for now, let me just go ahead and type my name in it. And obviously here we just end that with a semicolon. So this equals sign here is what we call an assignment operator. It doesn't mean that this value technically equals it. We're not comparing this value. We're saying, well, place this value here, whether it's a string, a number, whatever, into this called name. Okay, now, so as we've already seen, we can echo out a value within PHP and that will appear within our browser. However, what we now do, rather than reference directly a string or a number, we just go ahead and reference the variable that we've created. And again, we end this with a semicolon. So what we're now doing is saying we'll store this value in here and then just output whatever is stored within that variable. So if I come over to the browser and give that a refresh, you can see here we get the value out that we expected. Now, PHP doesn't care what we assign to a variable, and PHP is what we call a loosely typed language. In other languages, what you would have to do is say, well, I want to declare that this variable is storing a string. Now, what we can actually do is assign any data type to a variable. So as I've said before, we'll be looking at different data types in a couple of videos along, but for now, let's just quickly try this out by assigning a number to a variable. So let's get rid of this example and let's go ahead and say days in week. Now we know how many days are in a week, that's 7. So all we do is we assign the value 7, not within a string. You will get a little bit caught up if you do things like this, but we will be talking about that later when we look at adding numbers up and doing all sorts of mathematical operations. So for now, because we know that this is definitely a number, we want to assign it just a number with no single or double quotes. So this is now what we call an integer. So let's go ahead and just echo this out and we'll see what we get. So we're going to echo out days in week. Let's go over to the browser, give that a refresh, and you see we get 7. Now you might be wondering, this is a little bit weird because if this isn't a string, how isn't it being echoed out to the page? Because technically when we echo something out, we would expect it to be some kind of text. Well, behind the scenes, what's happening is PHP is saying, well, since you are outputting this, I'm going to kind of in the background convert this. It doesn't really work quite that simply, but basically that's what's happening here. So we can echo out integers, we can echo out floats, which are numbers with a decimal point, and other data types. There are some data types we can't echo out, and that is an array or an object, but we'll get to that a little bit later. Now, just before we go ahead, a little bit of advice about the naming convention of variables. Now, notice what I've done here is I've started this variable name with a lowercase d, and then I've gone ahead and without any spaces, which is really important because that just won't work, I've gone ahead and I've uppercased each subsequent word in this. Now, there are lots of different ways that you can name variables. So for example, I could have done this. If we just go ahead and refresh here, you can see that it doesn't work because it's looking for that exact case. So really important to remember this is case sensitive. Now, there are a couple of other ways that you can name variables. You can use underscores if you prefer. So let's just go ahead and switch this over with lowercase characters, just like that. So this is perfectly acceptable. The most important thing to do is stay consistent. Now, from being a developer for a while, the best thing to do and the most common way to do this is actually the way I originally did it. So this is called camel casing. You can also do things like Studley casing, which is where you have a capital at the start. But to be honest, most developers will use this convention when naming variables. But whatever you choose, whatever you think looks readable, it really does not matter. Don't let anyone tell you that you have to name things in a certain way. Just remember, keep it consistent. Don't switch between two different styles. Okay, so the next thing we're going to look at, we haven't quite looked at this yet, but we can actually concatenate, which means basically join text onto other text. So what does this mean? Well, in this case, echoing out days in the week on its own doesn't really make that much sense. Really, what we'd want to do is place this into a sentence. So let's just go ahead and echo the sentence out, and then we'll look at how we add this variable that we've created into this sentence so it joins together. So I'm going to say there are 7 days in a week. Now let's just say that the days in the week could change. Obviously it's not going to, but let's just assume that at some point we may have 8 days in a week in the future. Well, in this case, this is a hard-coded string. We don't have any flexibility over really changing this easily. And obviously this is a very simple example, but for more complex things, you might want to store variables elsewhere and then have things update based on the value of them variables. So in this case, what we can do is we can actually get rid of this and we can go ahead and concatenate on. Now, what I would normally do is if I was writing a string out and concatenating, I would do the following. Now that looks a little bit complicated. So what we're going to do is start this again and look at how we break this up. So let's go and echo out, there are. Now, after this, I'm going to place a space, but within the single quote. Then I'm going to go ahead and use a dot to concatenate on, which essentially just means join the variable. So I'm going to say days in week. Then I'm going to concatenate again using another dot, another string. So 2 single quotes here, we end the line. So there are days in week, days in the week, like so. So let's go ahead and check this out. And you can see there are 7 days in the week. Now, that's just a simple example. We're going to be covering concatenation in more detail later on, so don't worry if this is a little bit confusing. And of course, we're going to go and dive into different ways that we can do this too. Okay, so now that we've spoken about how we assign things to variables, the different data types, and gone ahead and had a brief look at concatenation, what I'm actually going to do is assign this string here, because we now have a new string, to another variable. Now it's highly likely that you'll do this. You want to build up different values based on other variables. And all this means is I'm going to say, well, the text here is equal to, or I'm assigning this text here to this text variable. Now, obviously this isn't going to work now because we're not doing anything with it. But of course, what we can now do is echo out that just there, like so. And that means that we can reuse this string anywhere else we want. So in actual fact, what we could do is duplicate this line down, head over to the browser and see that we have now output it twice. So essentially what we're doing here is we are storing a built up value. In this case, it's a concatenated string with a value that we already happen to have into a variable, and then we can reuse it more than once. So it just saves us a little bit of time. Now, of course, throughout the rest of the series, we're going to be looking more at exactly how we use variables, and by the end of the series, it will just be second nature to you. Okay, so there's one more thing I want to talk about, which is overwriting a variable. In order to do this, what we do is we basically just reassign a value. So let's say we had days in the week just here. Now, what if I were to do days in week equals 8, but keep this original value? Now, what's going to happen here is PHP is going to assign 7 to days in week. And then down here, since this is the next line down, it's then going to assign 8 to days in week. So if you just follow it down, that's exactly the order it's going to be assigned in. Now, because we already have this variable, we're not going to see an error. All we're going to see is this value overwritten. So if we refresh now, if we just echo this out, then you'll see there are 8 days in the week. And of course, we could do this however many times we want. Now, it's not always the case that in this very simple example, you would go ahead and overwrite this. In this case, you would simply change this. But there may be some kind of condition that means that you want to overwrite this particular value. And of course, we'll look at that later when we get to things like if statements and loops as well. Okay, so there's one more thing, actually, I did lie, that I want to talk to you about, and that's that you can echo something out at the same time you assign it. Now, this is a good idea if you want to echo something out and then use the value later on, or you're just testing around. So in this case, to see text equals and then this value, I could just do echo text. We know that that works. However, what I can do is just stick echo in the front of it. And sometimes this is really useful for testing if you just want to output something very, very quickly. just means you don't have to write echo text. You just write the word echo, and you can see that that works in exactly the same way. Okay, so this should give you enough information about variables to create them, use them, overwrite them, output them, concatenate, which, to be honest, is pretty much what you'll be doing all the time when you're writing code. Of course, like I said, we'll be using variables a lot throughout the series, so if something doesn't make sense here, you will pick it up in no time.